I'd like to welcome you back to the New Perspectives on Ancient Nubia series. I'm Aaron Brody, representing the Badè Museum at Pacific School of Religion. As always, this series is co-hosted by ARF at UC Berkeley. And before I introduce today's speaker, I'd like to welcome our curator, Melissa Craddock, who will read an introductory statement.
Thanks everyone for joining us today. We would like to start by acknowledging that Berkeley, California is on the territory of the Huchun, the ancestral and unceded land of the Chochenyo Ohlone. We respect the land itself and the people who have stewarded it throughout many generations, and we honor their elders, both past and present. There is no question that our society is poised at a moment of change. We see it when fellow Americans are unjustly detained, when our citizens are wrongly harmed, and when our communities are in the streets for months on end protesting in order to be heard. The Badè Museum of Biblical Archaeology and Archaeological Research Facility, ARF, at UC Berkeley, wish to acknowledge the pain and outrage of our community members who bear the weight of existing in a society designed to work against them and who feel the devastation most keenly. Here at the museum and at ARF, we have been moved by the courage of those most deeply affected and the tenacity of those protesting for change. The Badè Museum and ARF stand in solidarity with the African American community. We join you in your calls for justice. Collectively and individually, our staff condemns the police brutality and systemic racism that has long been enacted against the Black community and other communities of color. It has persisted for far too long. It has resulted in the unjust and premature ending of lives. So let us say their names: Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, Tamir Rice, Trayvon Martin, and countless others. Let us as organizations be perfectly clear: Black lives matter. We lend our thoughts and actions to those who every day actively work to make the statement a living, breathing ideal, and to those who continually live the reality of racial injustice. Likewise, we lend our expertise to the cause by incorporating BLM-sensitive material into our exhibits, programming, and curriculum. We know very well that this moment has been a long time coming, and we are in the fight for equality, justice, and accountability. Through this lecture series, we aim to raise awareness of Ancient Nubia, a vibrant region in Northeast Africa with a rich archaeological and historical legacy. Learning about the ancient peoples of Nubia is one way to decenter the usual academic focus on Egypt and biblical and classical lands in order to reconceptualize the past. Decolonizing our views of the past, as through the research presented in the New Perspectives on Ancient Nubia series, we hope will lead to a more just present and equitable future.
Thank you, Melissa. So it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Shayla Monroe, who is a doctoral candidate in anthropology at the University of California at Santa Barbara. Shayla specializes in faunal analysis, the social archaeology of Sudan and Egypt, the archaeology of ethnicity in the ancient Nile Valley, and African pastoralism. Her dissertation analyzes the acquisition of cattle at the ancient Egyptian colonial fortress of Askut and its implications for culture contact and asymmetrical power relations between pastoralists and non-pastoralists. Monroe earned her MA in anthropology from UCSB in 2014. Since 2013, she has worked as an archaeologist at the Third Cataract of the Nile River in Sudan, first at an Egyptian colonial site at Tombos, and then at the Kerma hinterland site, Abu Fatima, also in northern Sudan. Monroe is a Eugene Cota Robles Scholar and a recipient of the UC President's Dissertation Year Fellowship, who is also involved at the UC HBCU initiative as a field instructor for the UC Santa Cruz Anthropology program and as a summer mentor for the UC Santa Barbara Classics program. She serves as a graduate mentor to underrepresented students at UCSB, helping to foster an ethnically and culturally diverse campus. Monroe began her career at Howard University, where she earned degrees in anthropology and English in 2012. She also spent 2 seasons working at L'Hermitage Plantation, also known as the Best Farm Slave Village, with the National Park Service in Frederick, Maryland. Today, Ms. Monroe's presentation is entitled Animals in the Kerma Afterlife, Animal Burials and Ritual at Abu Fatima Cemetery, Sudan. Welcome, Shayla Monroe. We look forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Brody. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for having me. I'm so excited. Okay, so let me see if I can share my screen. Okay, so looking good?
Ms. Monroe, we can actually see the notes.
Okay.
So
Let me stop it. We'll try it again. Okay. Share the screen.
Perfect.
How about now? All right. So this presentation is about animal burials at Abu Fatima Cemetery. We'll talk about animals in the Kerma afterlife. So at first, I will give you a background on Kerma and Abu Fatima, and then we'll talk about the development of animal sacrifice in Kerma funerary rites, the religious role of sheep versus goats in Kerma, and then a little bit about dogs in the Kerma afterlife, and the implication for the archaeology of Kerma. And we'll talk a little bit about Saharan connections. And at the end, I'll propose a possible mode of cultural transmission for these burial rites. So the story of Kerma kind of begins with what we call the pre-Kerma transition. Around 3500 BC, human migration begins to intensify into the southern Sahara and the Sahel. This is, of course, a picture of the Sahara Desert as we know it today. This was a center for pastoralist groups who were highly mobile and moving across the area when there was still rainfall. But drying conditions and desert expansion started to open up new areas for these mobile pastoralists. It removed some of the humidity and epizootic barriers that were stopping cattle keepers from moving further south and further to the east and to the west. So you have increasingly mobile pastoralists. They're moving into new areas in search of resources and, most importantly, rain. And here is where you get pastoralists moving into the Upper Nile Valley. So from around 3500 BC up until 1550 BC, we're looking at a state-level society called Kerma. Well, I mean, I guess they didn't really reach state level until about 2500 BC. But so this is the time frame that we're looking at. We have the capital city of Kerma somewhere around the Third Cataract, very close to the Third Cataract. So you have an emphasis on agro-pastoralism, and eventually Kerma grows into an expansionist state about 12 kilometers upstream from the Third Cataract. So Kerma is known primarily from excavations around Kerma City and the Eastern Necropolis that houses the Royal Cemetery, and also Sai Island, another royal cemetery. And so it's most famous for these royal burials in the Eastern Necropolis and at Sai Island. And so here is that little circle is where Kerma is in relation to the rest of the Nile Valley. So Kerma chronology is divided into 3 phases they're in French because they were created by Swiss archaeologist Charles Bonnet. So you have Kerma Ancien, Kerma Moyen, and Kerma Classique, which is essentially ancient, middle, and classic Kerma. So Kerma Ancien develops into what Jeff Emberlin calls a pastoralist state, which means that unlike other early states where people kind of see a tension between agriculturalists and cattle pastoralists, pastoralism was in a variety of ways incorporated into the state apparatus in Kerma as it becomes increasingly complex. And Kerma Ancien grew in response to increased trade in the Mediterranean and continental African regions. And there was a heavy emphasis on animals. Animals were used for meat, dairy, leather, and bone that composed the raw materials for their tools. And animals also occupied like primary roles in Kerma thought, social construction, and cultural logic. So by the time we get to Kerma Moyen around 2000 BC, the Kerma people have mastered long distance trade, and they're amassing an enormous amount of wealth. So some of this wealth is cattle wealth. And here is when you start to see these enormous displays of cattle bucrania or cattle skull that are placed on the top of royal graves. So the dagger that you see here is a dagger with an ivory handle. It was excavated by Charles Bonnet, and it was discovered in one of the Kerma Moyen tombs. And so here you start to see the wealth, kind of an almost overwhelming sense of unimaginable wealth that's being put on display by the Kerma royal families. The largest of the Kerma royal tombs had a display of about 4,000 bucrania. So in this day and age, it's hard to imagine, it's hard to wrap your head around the amount of cattle wealth under Kerma's control. So Kerma didn't leave writing. They had administrative seals, but we don't really have a written system of record keeping like we do in Egypt. So this is where we tend to look for clues and symbols that kind of help us understand, Kerma thought and Kerma ways of knowing. So 1700, we move into Kerma Classique. And so this is a period where you see exquisite ceramic craftsmanship, beautiful leather goods. If you look at the pottery here, it looks like it's been glazed, but it hasn't. Kerma people mastered an art of vitrification. They could heat their ceramics to very high levels so that the outside looked almost glass-like, but it's not like they took something slick and put it over top of it. It was just the mastery in mastering that really unique vitrification technique. So when you think of the Kerma people, it's not just that they were wealthy, but also there was a sense of artistry that kind of pervades the way that they're making their clothes, the way that they're making their ceramics, the way that they're making their pottery. You could tell that art was very central to Kerma culture. So during those three periods, during the first two periods, we see the animal sacrifices, but what happens during the Kerma Classique period, and this is towards the end of Kerma's existence as a state, during that Kerma Classique period, we see a shift in a major shift in these tomb sacrifices. So we see a sharp decline in the number of animal sacrifices being included in royal tombs, and the animals are eventually replaced with people. So towards the end of the Kerma civilization, we're seeing that retainer sacrifice. We're seeing human people who are attached to the royal family being buried with the royal family rather than animals. And we also see the scorpion plaques. So the scorpion plaques lead some scholars to believe that somewhere in the process of these human beings being sacrificed or being buried with the members of the royal family, that there might have been some sort of drug or intoxicant involved, and that perhaps maybe that's kind of like what the scorpion means. But this area where we see the rise in human retainer sacrifice kind of marks the end of this era of animal sacrifice that we're going to be speaking about today. So looking at the animal world of Kerma, Almost all of the information we have about the zooarchaeology of Kerma comes from a Swiss zooarchaeologist named Louis Shay. So he first started by studying the Eastern necropolis, which is huge, but he also analyzed with Charles Badè fauna that came from the settlement of the royal city of Kerma. So he's looking at animals that were deposited into tombs in the cemetery, but he's also looking at animals that come from archaeological deposits from where people live. In addition to the actual animal bones, there's also visual information that Louis Shay analyzed. There is information about animals from clay sculpture, from wall paintings on the paintings of the walls on Kerma monuments like the Eastern Defufa, and funerary items that have animal imagery, imagery of cattle, sheep, dogs, even like beds. I should have included one that where the shape of the burial bed has the feet are shaped like cow feet. So there's a lot of imagery, animal imagery in the artwork of Kerma people that adds to our understanding of what these animals meant to them and their culture. So the development of animal sacrifice at Kerma includes these displays of these cattle lucrania, whole animal burials where you have an animal that's not really cut up, but it's actually buried whole without being butchered. But then you also have butchered cuts of meat where an animal is treated as if it's food, and it is then kind of placed in the grave with the deceased. So there are different types of animal deposits that are all happening in the same grave. So caprines, which means sheep and goat, are make up about 45% of the animal sacrifices at Kerma. Most of these caprines were male animals under 2 years of age, and they're placed in very specific places within the graves. So during the Kerma Moyen period or the Middle Kerma period, these animal deposits increased. So here we move to Abu Fatima Cemetery. So Abu Fatima Cemetery is we call it kind of like a middle-class cemetery. So this isn't a royal cemetery. This is a little bit further away, about 10 kilometers away from the royal cemetery. And so the people being buried here are what the Kerma equivalent of middle class would be. They're relatively elite, but not super wealthy. And in this cemetery, we have human and animal burials from the Ancient, Moyen, and Classique Kerma periods. Abu Fatima Cemetery is under the co-direction of Dr. Sarah Schrader and Dr. Stuart Tyson Smith. And initially, these animal faces were a bit unexpected, but excavations from 2015 and 2017 yielded the remain of 3 goats, which were cut up into many, many pieces. I had to count them all. 2 young rams that were buried whole, and 1 dog. So unexpectedly, we were dealing with an assemblage of animal deposits, and we began to compare those animal deposits to the deposits found at the Kerma Royal Cemetery. So one of the things we noticed, like I said, the goats were cut up. So we had 2 different types of animal deposits there. Now, Abu Fatima has some site suppression on the top, so we don't actually have any bucrania. But we did have meat offerings, and we did have whole animals. And the first type of offering I'm going to talk about is the meat offering. So at the Royal Cemetery, some of the patterns that Shay noticed were that he found similar proportions of right and left elements, meaning that people were chopping up like cuts of meat, and they weren't, as in, some ritual traditions, only using the left side or only using the right side. It seemed like both sides of the body were being used. Meat from the same individuals was normally gathered for an offering in the same grave. So they weren't cutting up one goat and spreading it out over many different graves. They would butcher like one animal and put it there. And so they were clustered by animal. So some tombs in the Eastern necropolis contain more than 75 like cuts of meat. And several of the meat cuts that Shay found were found in or under pots. So here we have kind of a graphic representation of Shay describing like which cuts of meat, and by cuts of meat, it's like a chunk of an animal, sorry, but there's no other way to say that, that they were finding. And here's the pattern of how these cuts of meat were being presented in the graves. So what I'm going to show you now are two cuts of meat, an example of what these cuts of meat look like at Abu Fatma instead of the Royal Cemetery. So in the picture coming up, you'll see a shoulder joint. Well, that's the second picture. In the second picture, you'll see a shoulder joint, but in the first picture, you'll see this cut, which is kind of the lower spine leading down to the tail. So both of these are the types of cuts of meat that ancient Kermans would have seen as, you know, a culinary cut. So here we have that lower spine. Unfortunately, in terms of comparing to the Royal Cemetery, we're off to a little bit of a rough start because directionally it's supposed to be on the other side, but you know, who am I to judge? But we see that here's that precise cut that he's illustrating is the lower spine going all the way down to the tail. And in here, we have a shoulder cut where you have the scapula and the humerus kind of connected together. And this is placed underneath a pot. So right away, we see that the practice at Abu Fatma is similar to that at the Eastern necropolis. And that apparently what we're seeing in the Royal Cemetery might not necessarily be a royal practice, but just a Kerma practice in general. So the composition of human burials kind of changes over time, and the animals that accompanied the humans, human deceased changes over time. At the Royal Cemetery in later periods, you'll see multiple burials are common. And you'll also see that some graves have increased meat offerings. So sometimes they're burying more than one royal family member in the same grave. And in those graves where you have multiple family members, you have an increase of meat offerings. So one of the things that these meat cuts give us a chance to do is to look at some of the ancient butchery patterns. One of the things that Shay noticed immediately was that some of the ancient butchery patterns look very similar to butchery patterns in modern day Sudan. And my own observations support that. The still that you see here is from a video I took where I was out watching Nubian people in Tumbos butcher a sheep. And so in terms of where they actually place the blade and the order and the manner in which they dismember the animal, it is very, very similar to the way that Nubian cultures have butchered these animals in the past. So Shay did notice that butchery patterns in the necropolis differed from the ancient cities. So they're still treating, you know, these butchery cuts like meat, but there's kind of like your everyday butchery, and then there's kind of your ritual butchery. So here we just kind of see that the looking archaeologically, that the breaking of the rib cage and then you know, breaking up of those parts in the middle, like that lower spine, etc., seem to be, you know, performed with some sort of stone axe. And here in the bottom photo, I have a friend, he's our friend of our project, his name is Muhammad, I'm watching him kind of cut this animal up in the same way, removing the legs first, and then kind of going to work on that midsection to kind of break apart those different culinary parts in the torso. So what's very interesting about not only just the longevity of, you know, this type of butchery practice, but how embodied it is. So as I was going through my videos and my pictures and looking at specifically looking at the ease with which Muhammad was cutting up this animal and breaking the body into those typical butchery parts, I noticed that in all of the pictures, the cigarette in his mouth did not move once. And so to me, that says a little bit about how embodied this is and how he doesn't even have to think about it and doesn't even have to put forth, you know, so much effort. Like literally the cigarette did not move in all the pictures. So looking at funerary rites at Kerma and Abu Fatima, we're seeing that there's a ritual deposit of caprine meat cuts. Shay made the argument to call this a ritual in 2003 because he said that he's defining a ritual as rule governed and consistently replicated over time. So as he's looking at the way these animal deposits are placed, he's looking at where all the different pieces are being placed consistently over time. And he sees that the rule that's being followed over the course of so many generations kind of necessitates that we consider this a ritual. So what we find is that with the exception of that like lone lower lumbar that's like off to the northeast, Abu Fatima is generally consistent with the pattern of animal deposits found at the Eastern necropolis. And so, like I said earlier, this is our first chance to kind of look at the fact that, okay, maybe these deposits aren't exclusive to the royal family throughout, you know, Kerma Ancien and Kerma Moyen, but we're looking at something that is a Kerma-wide practice. We haven't had a lot of data from hinterland sites and cemeteries that were not royal Kerman cemeteries. So now we're starting to see, and we're getting the chance to see, okay, what's a royal practice versus what is a Kerma cultural practice? So we have certain skeletal elements that are absent. We have skulls, mandibles, metapodials, and phalanges are not found amongst the meat cuts. We have goat skulls are not used generally by Nubian cultures. Occasionally you will see goat skulls used by one Nubian group, the Pangrave people, but in Kerma, the actual heads of goats don't seem to play any visible role. And so the heads are not there. Maybe they're not edible, or maybe they were used for some, you know, other reason, but they're not found amongst the meat cuts. So 45% of the faunal remains in the necropolis belong to caprines. You have the meat cuts that are coming from goats. And then you have the whole animals that are coming, that are actually sheep. So we're seeing a difference in the way that sheep are goat are treated in a mortuary sense. And I'm wondering if there's some connection to just kind of the ideological differences between goat and sheep in the Nile Valley. You have plenty of ram gods, which we'll talk about in just a second, but there really are no kind of goat-headed gods. And goats are not really given that same space in the ideological realm that male sheep or rams are. So in order to actually confirm that I was looking at different treatment for sheep and goats, I had to kind of gather up all of these goat chunks that were placed in these graves. And so at the end of each season, I had to count up all the little pieces for goat that were goat. And then I had to actually make sure that it was actually goat. So I use a Lapham Zader scale. Heather Lapham and Melinda Zader have a scale for making sure that a sheep is a sheep and a goat and a goat. In some circumstances, this could have been a zooarchaeological nightmare, but I was able to make it work because I had the best of circumstances. I had a house full of biological anthropologists who were just kind of helping me make sure that the sheep were sheep and the goat were goat. And then also the biggest benefit I had was that the sheep were buried whole. So the sheep were buried whole with their heads, had sheep there from rooter to tutor. So what I had to do was just make sure that all the goat elements were not sheep elements. And so I was able to kind of say with confidence at the end that like all of the butchered meat was goat and all of the two animals that were buried whole were sheep. And so now I have to explain what you are about to see, speaking of sheep. As we were digging, and this is January 2017, I was going down, excavating in a tomb, and I see, as I'm brushing away sand, two little horns sticking up out of the sand. And, you know, I've learned after my 5 years, my 5 seasons in Sudan to be ready for anything. And I just thought, oh, Lord, I'm digging up the devil. It really looked like I was digging up the devil because all I could see were these two little horns. So I keep excavating. And then after, you know, I'm going a few centimeters down, and instead of just two little horns, I see two little horns sticking up and like some orange bangs like coming down in the middle of the horns. And I'm thinking, well, if I'm digging up the devil, this is the goofiest devil that I've ever seen. So I keep going down, and this is what I see. So this picture here is this little ram kind of became the star of the show. There was some disturbance in the grave. So his head was actually tilted down with his face down in the dirt. But for some reason, he's wearing like a head of orange hair. Obviously, he was kind of like a golden orange color, and he lost all of his fur except what looks like a toupee just kind of sitting on his head. So our conservator goddess actually like really indulged me, and she used some consolidate to make sure we could keep his hair on his head. And he now lives with us in the Smith lab at at UCSB. But he was one of the two little rams that we found that were buried whole. So sheep and rams in particular are very important in Kerma. The Kerma sheep are taller than average. They're kind of rangy animals. And the way they were buried, some of the sheep seem to be like forced into flex positions and placed in leather bags before burial. That's at the Royal Cemetery. Neither of our sheep was in a bag. They were both just out. But here is an example of a sheep that's actually in the right place, but it's right behind the deceased human. So in the ancient Nile Valley, we have two types of sheep, and both types of sheep were present in Egypt and Kerma. First, we have Longipes, which is a sheep that has spiral-shaped horns that go out horizontally. So you have an image here of Longipes sheep where you can see the horns just kind of going out to either side. The sheep below it is not a Longipes sheep. It's a sheep that's similar that has those horizontal horns, and it's just there for comparison, as are these two. These are just pictures of sheep that have the type of horns like Longipes where they go out to the side. The second type of Nile Valley sheep, or sheep that we found in the Nile Valley, is called Platora, and it had semicircular horns that go forward. So what's interesting is that even though both sheep were present in Egyptian culture and Kerma culture, artistically and in renderings, early Egyptians tended to prefer Longipes, and the Kermans tended to prefer Platora. So when you look at early Egyptian ram deities, they tend to have a preference for these horns to go out to the side. And then when you look at Kerma deities or Kerma representations of kingship with the horns, they tend to prefer those forward-facing horns. So sheep symbolism becomes really big. It's really big in both parts of the Nile Valley. But sheep become more important ideologically because of climate change. So that same trajectory of climate change that started to drive some of these Saharan pastoralists into the upper and middle Nile is continuing, and it is becoming increasingly difficult to maintain these huge cattle herds. So as cattle herds are declining and dependence on caprines is increasing, we also see an ideological and artistic importance placed on sheep. And so you start to see these sheep horns, kind of everywhere, but it's happening unevenly throughout the Nile Valley. So I think it was Richard Laban first had this theory that, especially towards the New Kingdom, when you have Egyptian colonialism in Nubia, Amun and other members of the Egyptian pantheon go down to Nubia. Some sort of syncretic razzle-dazzle happens with Amun and indigenous Nubian deities, and Amun goes back to Egypt with forward-facing horns. Also during this time, it's been pointed out to me that Langipis went extinct. So in addition to the sheep with the spiral facing horns, the spiral horns going extinct, we also have the kind of the traveling, or we have the kind of the movement of this kind of Kerman idea of kingship, or this Kerman imagery of kingship with these forward-facing horns kind of mashing together with the Egyptian god of Amun. So when Amun goes back, his horns are now curled forward. Now, this is obviously not an authentic Egyptian statue. This was made by an Italian company that for some reason makes these replicas of ancient Egyptian statues with like 12 packs. It's always like pow, 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 like all down the middle. I am unprofessional, so I feel like I have to put one of these in every PowerPoint, but I can't talk about forward-facing horns without this like big Marvel version of a Nile Valley ram god. So the next animal, the final animal we talk about is the dog. So we have this dog that we found at Abu Fatma, and we also have another dog, a Napan dog that we found at Tampos, but that's, neither here nor there. So this was the second dog that we'd actually excavated in a very short amount of time, but this was the only dog that we found at Abu Fatma. And you have to forgive the photo. It was hard to clean the photo in situ because his skin was kind of attached, or her skin was kind of attached and was flaking off. So in terms of dogs at Kerma, there were 22 dog burials in the Eastern Necropolis. And there are two types of dogs that we find archaeologically in the ancient Nile Valley. You have the big mastiff type of dogs that were kind of considered war dogs, but they had a lot of different functions. And then you have the lean dogs that kind of look like a greyhound or a whippet. So these dogs that were found at Abu Fatma, and the dog was found at Abu Fatma, and the dogs that are found in these Kerma graves are the lean type of Nile Valley whippet dog. They are more prevalent in Kerma Ancien and Kerma Moya graves. And in those graves, they were placed behind the caprines. So they're essentially placed behind the sheep in a herding position. That, of course, was one of the most prevalent roles for dogs in Kerma. Kerma was a pastoralist society. So herding dogs and dogs that could herd sheep and cattle were very important. So the dog at Abu Fatma, based on tooth wear and lipping on the vertebra, indicated that it was a mature animal. And this contrasts with the caprines, because the sheep and the goats were all 2 years and under based on their epiphyseal fusion. So this is different than an animal that's kind of only raised to be a sacrifice. This animal had a collar and it appeared to be a companion animal. So based on all of these findings, we have, a start to kind of offer a preliminary comparison of these animal deposits at Abu Fatma with those of the Royal Cemetery. So what we see that there are species-specific mortuary treatments at Abu Fatma. Goat are treated one way, sheep are treated another way, dogs are buried whole. We have ages at death are the same. The ages of the caprine sacrifices at Abu Fatma are the same as the ages at the Royal Cemetery. We have the placement of some of the Abu Fatma animals matches the placement of the animal deposits at the Royal Cemetery of Kerma. So as we continue to work at Abu Fatma, we hope to have many years ahead of us kind of working at Abu Fatma. We have to kind of look for where these patterns will merge. And what we're trying to see is how extensively will patterns of placement overlap? Will Abu Fatma continue to look like the Royal Cemetery in terms of animal sacrifices, or will it diverge? Will something be different? Oops, excuse me. So we'll be looking to see, how similar or how different Abu Fatma and the rest of the animal sacrifices, hopefully that we find, will be compared to the Royal Cemetery. So Louis Shay talks about some of the implications of these animal burials and this ritual. The economics of meat sacrifice, pointing out that, there's something really important about the fact that you can take meat and place it in a grave for a person on, a supernatural journey and not use that meat to feed a living person. So there's kind of an economic sacrifices there that kind of tells you that the people at the Royal Cemetery and the people at Abu Fatma could afford it, right? By all accounts, according to, Dr. Sarah Schrader, Dr. Michelle Bouzon, most of the Kerman populations that we have studied are healthy, well-fed people. So what we're seeing is that it looks like, they're able to kind of develop these kind of sacrifices, number one, because they can afford it. Louis Shay also noticed some gender differences. He says that on average, there are less meat deposits for women versus men. Now, everybody gets meat deposits. Men, women, children, and elders all get meat in their graves at the Royal Cemetery. But on average, the deposits for women are smaller than they are for men. And on average, the deposits for children are smaller than they are for adults. But one thing that Shay comes back to is this consistent use of space in cardinal direction. That, there's a very precise method to where the sheep goes, where the goat goes, and it seems to be repeated over and over again over a long period of time. So the meat cuts are most consistently in the northern or western part of the pit. So I guess ours was in the northeastern part of one of them was in the northeast part of the pit. So it's still kind of in the north. And the sheep are on the other side. So Kerma animal burials were actually similar to burials of another group of people, the Nubian Sea group. They're a related group of people. And so Pernilla Banksgaard studied the Sea group animal burials, and she did a systematic comparison. And what she found, it kind of supports, this long standing connection between the Kerma and the Nubian Sea group. There obviously, there's a lot of overlap in the precision of the animal burials of the Sea group and Kerma. So these similarities kind of point to a shared Saharan connection, kind of like looking at their roots. And not only do you see similarities in the placement of these animals in these burials, you also see the same shift in emphasis. So while both of these cultures are kind of dealing with climate change, you see them kind of shift away from the emphasis on cattle and shift towards an emphasis on caprines that are a little bit easier to maintain and keep viable as rainfall is decreasing over time in the region. So whereas Shay placed a greater emphasis on spatial patterning, like, look, each thing is in its place, Banksgaard kind of went a little further and emphasized that each species was deposited in a specific order, with sheep being first, interred while the tomb was open, and cattle going last, kind of being put on top after the grave was closed. And so Banksgaard proposes that this order is significant because of this idea that sheep are, associated with the community of the living, and that cattle are associated with the realm of the ancestors. So this is an interesting idea to keep in mind. And thinking about this, I think I wanted to approach this kind of thinking about the physical and bodily experience of performing this ritual. So what I tried to imagine was, what would it look like if we work through the burial step by step? First, the tomb is like opened, and then a cattle hide is prepared. So one of the similarities between these Kerman burials and these C group burials is that before anything begins, the entire tomb is kind of lined with the hide of cattle. Then the human is placed first because it's the human's grave. The human is lowered into the grave. Then the whole caprines, the whole sheep, are placed into the grave. After the sheep comes the meat cuts, where you have a goat that is recently skinned and freshly butchered. After the goat comes the pottery. So you saw how the goat was like kind of tucked underneath the pot. Sometimes the goat is in the pot, and sometimes the pottery is kind of stuck on top of it. Then after the goat comes the dog. So if there's a dog in the tomb, the dog is kind of herding the sheep. So the dog is put behind the sheep, the caprines. And then once the tomb is covered over, that last bit is, if it's a royal tomb or if it's an early C group tomb, those bucrania are then going to go on top. So you have kind of this order that people are doing things in, and the consistency is not just through time over this 800 years, it's also kind of across a very large geographical space. So theorizing ancient memory keeping, the question is, how was the ritual kept so consistent over time? How was the knowledge handed down through the generations? How would Kermans and C group Nubians teach and learn the order and placement in a ritual that was hundreds of years old? So if this starts around 2500 BC and ends around 1700 BC, this is 800 years that the people who didn't have writing are passing along a very precise type of knowledge. So I think in order to answer this question, we have to go way back to the beginning. We have complex cattle keepers as early as 6200 BC in the Central Sahara. Now, this is not when the relationship between like cattle and spirituality begins. That's much earlier. But what we can see in the Central Sahara around 6200 BC via rock art and monumental burials is a very intensified way of using cattle in burial that is like well established and is prolific by 6200 BC. So these populations are moving back and forth between the Nile. And this kind of leads to another archaeological horizon that the David Wingrove and all called the primary pastoral community. So in the next millennia, between like 5000 and 4000 BC, or I guess like 2 millennia later, what we're seeing is an archaeological horizon made up of several categories of material evidence that when cattle keepers start to leave the Sahara and move south into the Libyan desert, into the wadis, they're bringing with them something more than cattle. So there's a cultural horizon that comes in when we see this influx of the way that cattle cultures are coming in from the desert and influencing bodily performance. They are cycling from the Sahara to Upper Nubia and then northward, and they're bringing things like new types of combs, new types of jewelry, new types of beads based, from long distance trade. And so like this little collection of doodads might not look like much, but to an archaeologist looking at like new sophisticated tools for doing your hair, looking at, new tools for making clothing, looking at makeup palettes that go, that have more colors. What we imagine when we see something like this is people coming into the Nile Valley, their hair is laid, their face is beat, they got the beads, the pendants, the bangles, possibly some piercings. From an archaeological point of view, it just looks like these cattle keepers come into the Nile Valley with like a full pastoralist drip and just stunt on everyone, because this is something new, in terms of like this very intensified bodily display of like turning your body into a work of art. So this is a time that's very generative. These centuries when these cattle keepers are moving towards the Nile, this is a time when art is flourishing. This is a time when sculpture is flourishing. It's a time of fluorescence and human expression. And so after 4000 BC, we have this kind of leader band culture, which is kind of like a mashup of a bunch of people. They're in this area around these, the Libyan desert, but then below that, you have the Wadi Hawara and Wadi al-Malik. And in this area, this is where linguist Claude Rilly is looking at this area. He said, he thinks that this is where the mother language of the Nubian language family is formed in this time and place. So languages are exploding and artistic styles are exploding. And this is a time of intense, like intellectual fluorescence. So what does this have to do with the ritual? Oh, also, sorry. This is Lakia, which was a central node for intense culture contact between all of these different pastoralist groups kind of coming and going between the Sahara and the Nile. So I guess what I wanted to say with this slide was that instead of looking at the Saharan migrations kind of like swooping in smoothly, we have to think that there's a period of time when people are just moving very intensely in this place. Also coming in from Western Darfur, like over to the West. And so this is a time of that intensified creativity and fluorescence. So that Saharan migration into the Nile doesn't look like an arrow that's really smooth. It just looks like all these people everywhere exchanging ideas and really kind of like leaning into these centuries of intense creativity. So back to the rituals at Kerma and the question of how was the ritual kept so consistent over time and space? How was the knowledge handed down through generations? How would Kermans teach and learn the order and placement in a ritual that was hundreds of years old? I'm thinking perhaps through song. So this is a thought experiment. I have absolutely no evidence. It is just kind of the hypothesis of a hypothesis. Being in Northern Sudan, those 5 seasons, and thinking about Nubian culture and thinking about how music in Nubia is not just like an afterthought or a hobby, but it's so central to community life. One of the things I'm thinking is that music might have been a repository for how these ritual protocols were supposed to take place. Music is so central to community life, and songs and poetry, song traditions and poetic traditions tend to travel, with pastoralists. So what if, at some point, in that Wadi Hor region, there developed a song, that had to do with how these burials take place. And then over time, as people spread out into the Nile Valley, they go their separate ways and they have their variation of the song, but the song is what's keeping everything so completely consistent and in order, because it becomes a way to kind of preserve the memories of the ritual. So why would I even propose this hypothetical burial ballad? It's just a reflection on my part. My initial reflections for what type of institution might have been responsible for keeping this kind of ritual knowledge were so Western, and they didn't really make a lot of Nubian sense. So this is kind of an exercise for me to think, even as we get more data, even as we measure these patterns, that our hypotheses kind of have to be, in conversation with living Nubians and living Nubian culture. And also the hypothesis should make kind of a Nubian kind of sense. So here's one possible explanation for how this knowledge was passed down. A song or kind of a burial ballad where the burials, telling how the burial should be conducted, explaining to the people burying what goes where, and explaining the roles that these animals play in the human journey to the afterlife. And that's it. As always, I want to thank the people of Tumbos.
Thank you so much for this super fascinating talk. We have a ton of questions that I'm going to start throwing at you. But before I do that, I just want to briefly respond. Well, first, thank you for sharing your hypothesis about the song and how that might carry memory through generations. And I want to respond to that because I thought of, in my area of research in the Levant, Bronze Age Levant, the Canaanite story, The Tale of Akkad. So it's a piece of literature that basically part of it goes through each step that would take upon the death of someone in a high status household, the number of years someone would mourn, where the mourning would take place, who was involved, and at least vaguely the roles of the different people who were involved. And even some of the material culture, including use of music like cymbals and other instruments. So I just wanted to point that out in case you're not aware of it, and maybe we can chat about that.
I'm not, but I would love to chat about that. Like this is a new area for me. I look at dead animals. So like I haven't spent a lot of time thinking about like, well, how do they know where to put it? That's fascinating.
So yeah, I'll follow up with you about that. I want to get to some of our audience questions. There were really so many that came in, quite a few about dogs. I think whenever dogs enter the picture, people love to latch onto that. So one question, less about the dogs and the burials and more about dogs in everyday life. Is there archaeological evidence for Kerman's relationships with dogs, like training or breeding, that might give us some insight as to why they were put into burials?
Shay speculates that it really is just kind of the primacy of herding in the culture. In terms of breeding, he also says that the dogs in the Kerma cemetery are all the same size, which if they're not being specifically selected, there is a chance that someone's kind of breeding them to kind of all look alike. And, the other thing is just like weird little tidbits, like sometimes he could find stomach contents and the dogs ate a lot of fish. So, I mean, they're living on a river. So fish is something that they would like feed to the dogs.
Okay, great. Thank you. That's really fascinating that they're all the same size. Great evidence possibly for breeding. Is there evidence as to why the dogs were killed for burial? Or sorry, as to whether they were killed for burial specifically?
Well, I mean, they're in there, so I can't imagine. I would imagine that the dog was probably put down at the same time as the sheep. Yeah, it doesn't make sense for them to take like a dog that's already dead and like put it in there. I think it's a little bit, kind of jarring, but also you have to think that, towards the end of, Kerma Classique, it wasn't dogs so much as it was people. So this is a culture that has a very different sense of what needs to happen when a royal person gets buried. And so and then later on, we have horse burials in Nubia, as horse culture kind of comes into the Sudanic kingdoms, sometimes kings are buried with their horses. So, and not just kings, but other people too. So the idea of an animal going with you into the afterlife seems a little bit jarring to us. But for them, it was probably like, well, I'm going on a journey. I got to take my dog,
Yeah, and based on the sequence of burial that you reconstructed for us, it seemed that this would be a relatively quick burial, so maybe all taking place within one day as opposed to a prolonged process.
Right.
Okay, yeah, so that makes sense. So based on that reconstruction that you shared with us, the order that the species and materials were added to the graves, can archaeologists begin to reconstruct a standard or regional burial sequence? You did mention that it seems to be pretty consistent over time and space. So would you call it some kind of standard sequence?
I would call it a testable hypothesis because, I made this up on a PowerPoint, So, but also realizing that Kerma archaeology, like for a long time, Louis Shea was the only one in the game. We're still putting all of this together piece by piece. So it's very nascent, it's emergent. So yeah, this is a testable standard. I mean, I wouldn't call it a standard, I'd call it a testable hypothesis that hopefully as other people gather more grave data, they can say, okay, they can match this and say, does this kind of fit this pattern? Then we might have something if we could get, more people kind of weighing in and adding data to it.
Yeah, well, on that note, that's also what I researched in the Levant is burial sequences. So I would love to exchange more with you after this about that. So shifting gears a little bit now to the modern Nubians that you were photographing and observing doing the butchery. Do they employ any kinds of songs or chants as they were conducting that ritual butchering?
No, I didn't see, songs are happening all over the place, but I didn't see any butchery specific songs. Yeah, but it was very, I don't want to say joyful. It's kind of like a fun guy thing, if that makes any sense. Like, when they come together to butcher, like if you're going to butcher a whole sheep, that means everybody's eating. That means you're probably having, some sort of get together. That was a get together where they did 2 sheep. And it's a little bit rowdy and, the guys are joking and laughing. It's very like, it looks fun. Like, I don't want to do it or touch it, but from the outside, there's a lot of camaraderie and there's like a lot of fun when they come together to kind of like do this like skinning. So I didn't see any song, but I also know that there are certain people within the village who are like known to be good butchers, and it's a valuable skill. Like, you get a lot of respect if you are the person, like our butcher extraordinaire is this guy named Haitham. You get like a lot of respect if you're really good at like skinning and cutting the animal like well.
And a related question, are there clear patterns in terms of like social patterns? Is it always men who are doing the butchering in these kinds of ritual scenarios?
From what I've seen, yes, but you also have to realize, so this is like Nubian roots with kind of like a Sufi culture, Islamic culture, like laid on top of it. So because of that, and I'm not really sure how that works, I'm not sure it would be cool for women to do this because it's kind of gross. And, the thing about tumbos is kind of sweet when you think about it. People make sure that women don't have to really do things that are gross. Like, so it's just kind of like in their kind of religious culture to not like, it's an animal. So there's intestines like have to be squeezed out. And so it's kind of against that sensibility to have like women squeezing intestines. That's like, no, let the boys do that. I hope I'm not overgeneralizing, but that's the sense that I get. Like, there are certain things that they're just like, the men are like, we'll do that,
Yeah. So going back then to the ancient evidence, could the difference in treatment between the goats and the sheep be based on a more practical consideration of whether they were food animals and supplied secondary products as opposed to this ideological interpretation?
Well, they're both food animals, right? So in the world of the living, people are eating both sheep and goat. And, there are reasons why, some people like sheep. Sheep are really fatty. Goats reproduce more often. So, there's an advantage to keeping both goat and sheep. There are several advantages to kind of keeping these mixed herds. They're all being eaten by the living. The difference is, and they're all going into, the grave. But the difference is, why not butcher the sheep? And so Shay's thinking that this is something about the journey, like something's happening on this death journey where I need my sheep whole, I need my dog whole. The goat is associated with pottery. It's like in a pot or under a pot. So there's the food. He calls it like a viaticum, but that's also like him speculating on, you know, maybe these person is being given things for, you know, a trip, for a journey. And so that's the, I don't know, you know, but what is practical? That might be, you know, you know, from Nubian point of view, that might be practical. It's like, you know.
It could always be a combination.
Yeah.
Practical and ideological, right? Okay, so I'm going to ask one final question so that we can wrap it up. So on that same topic, talking about the consumption of meat, when you were showing the possible reconstruction of a burial with the leather on the bottom and then the head or the bucrania on the top of the grave, what would then happen to that cattle meat? Because there's a lot that's left over. Presumably it would be eaten. And so is that assumption true? And if so, would it be in a kind of feast scenario?
So that's what we're guessing. So feasting and cattle feasting, they shouldn't necessarily be seen as separate. And this is going back through the Wadi Howar. This is going back all the way to the Sahara. You see these enormous, first of all, you see the heads being used on the graves. This is going back, you know, the earliest is actually like around 10,000 BC, like, but that's a wild cow. It's not a domesticated cow. But yes, you can assume that there's some sort of feast involved. So and I guess that's part of my reflection, is trying not to think of this as a somber occasion just because that's how we conceptualize as death. People are eating at these funerary feasts. There is food involved. So I guess that's the thing, like thinking of it as both things that happen when someone dies. Yes, there is special placement of the bones in a certain way, but there's a lot of food happening. You know, cows have a lot of meat on them. People, you need a lot of people to kind of eat all that food without a refrigerator. So you imagine that even though there is kind of what Shay calls that economic sacrifice, the economic sacrifice is not divorced from like economic reality, which is we don't need to waste this. We need to pull together as many people as we can to eat all this beef so that it didn't go to waste. So I see them as two things that would have very commonly throughout all of these cultures happened at once. Everybody's going to eat, and we're also going to, you know, have what we need in order to complete this kind of spiritual ritual.
Well, thank you so much. I'm going to end it there. This concludes our lecture and our Q&A segment for today. Thank you so much, Shayla Monroe, for sharing your time and your expertise with us and with the wider public who's tuning in today and who watches this video in the future. Thank you to the viewers for your interest in this topic and in the history of